Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The dining room felt warm and cozy that Sunday evening, filled with the aroma of my famous pot roast and the gentle clatter of silverware against china. I had spent hours preparing everything perfectly. The table set with our wedding china, candles flickering softly, and even fresh flowers from our garden as a centerpiece. This was exactly the kind of family gathering I loved hosting. "Ophelia, this roast is absolutely delicious," my mother-in-law Helen said, cutting another bite with precise movements. At 59, she maintained the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her a successful elementary school principal for over 30 years. "What's your secret ingredient?" I beamed with pride, adjusting my burgundy blouse and smoothing my dark hair behind my ear. "Just a touch of red wine and some herbs from the garden. Nothing too fancy, but I'm glad you like it." My husband Marcus smiled at me from across the table, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners, the way they had since we first met 8 years ago. At 36, he still had that boyish charm that made me fall for him, even if his accounting job had given him a slightly more serious demeanor over the years. "Mom always appreciates good cooking," Marcus said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Remember how she used to critique every girlfriend I brought home?" "I was protecting you from bad cooks," Helen laughed, but her eyes were studying our 6-year-old daughter Ellie, who was picking at her vegetables with typical childlike determination to avoid anything green. Ellie had inherited my olive complexion and dark wavy hair, but her bright green eyes were definitely not from my side of the family. She was chattering about her art class at school, describing a painting she'd made of our family dog with purple fur and rainbow spots. "She's got such an artistic eye," my sister Sophie commented, twirling her fork in the mashed potatoes. At 28, Sophie still maintained that carefree attitude that made her popular at the marketing firm where we both worked. "Look at those cheekbones too. She's going to be a heartbreaker." "She definitely has strong features," Helen observed, tilting her head as she studied Ellie more closely. "Those eyes are so striking. They're such an unusual shade of green." My father-in-law Dennis nodded from his seat at the head of the table. The retired construction foreman had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. "Pretty girl. Got her mother's coloring, that's for sure." "Actually," I said with a laugh, feeling relaxed and confident in the warm family atmosphere, "she reminds me more of my high school sweetheart. Same eyes, same bone structure. It's funny how genetics work sometimes." The words slipped out so naturally, accompanied by what I thought was an innocent giggle. I was just making conversation, sharing an amusing observation. After all, people comment on family resemblances all the time. But the reaction around the table was immediate and uncomfortable. Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and he gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Helen's eyebrows rose slightly, and she exchanged a quick glance with Dennis, who had gone completely still. Sophie let out a nervous giggle, but even she seemed to sense the sudden tension. "Your high school sweetheart?" Helen asked carefully, her voice taking on that measured tone she probably used with difficult students. I felt my cheeks flush slightly, realizing my comment might have sounded stranger than I intended. "Oh, you know what I mean. Just one of those weird coincidences. People always say kids look like random relatives or family friends. It doesn't mean anything." "Of course not," Marcus said quickly, but his voice sounded forced. He took a large bite of roast and chewed thoughtfully, avoiding eye contact with everyone at the table. Dennis cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. "Kids can look like anyone. My brother's boy looks exactly like the mailman, but that doesn't mean anything." The comparison made everyone even more uncomfortable. Sophie tried to lighten the mood by asking Ellie about her favorite subject in school, but the conversation felt strained for the rest of the meal. Later, as we were loading the dishwasher and Helen was wiping down the counter with military precision, She approached me with a concerned expression. Ophelia, dear, that comment about Ellie looking like your ex-boyfriend, that was just a joke, right? I forced a laugh, scrubbing a plate more vigorously than necessary. Of course it was just a joke, Helen. You know how people say kids look like the strangest people sometimes. I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sure you didn't, she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. It's just that Marcus seemed a bit taken aback. Marcus knows I was just being silly, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. He's probably just tired from work. You know how busy tax season keeps him. Helen nodded slowly, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was the type of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. After everyone had gone home and we'd tucked Ellie into bed, Marcus and I were getting ready for sleep when he finally brought it up. That thing you said at dinner, he began carefully, sitting on the edge of our bed and pulling off his socks. About Ellie looking like your high school boyfriend. That was kind of a weird thing to say. I was brushing my teeth at the bathroom sink, and I spit out the toothpaste before responding. Oh my God, Marcus, you're not seriously upset about that, are you? It was just a random comment. People say stuff like that all the time. I know, but... He paused, running his hands through his thinning brown hair. Is there something I should know? Something you want to tell me? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I felt a flutter of panic in my chest, but I quickly pushed it down and replaced it with indignation. Are you seriously asking me that? I turned to face him fully, crossing my arms over my chest. Marcus, we've been married for 8 years. Ellie is your daughter. I can't believe you'd even think something like that based on one silly comment. He held up his hands defensively. I'm not thinking anything. I'm just saying it was a strange thing to say, and my mum seemed worried about it. Your mum worries about everything, I scoffed, climbing into bed beside him. Remember when she was convinced our neighbour was stealing our newspaper because it was delivered 5 minutes later than usual? Marcus smiled at that memory, and I felt some of the tension ease. You're right, she does overthink things sometimes. Exactly, I said, snuggling closer to him and resting my head on his shoulder. You know I love you and Ellie more than anything in the world. That comment meant absolutely nothing. He wrapped his arms around me and kissed the top of my head. I love you too. I'm sorry for making a big deal out of nothing. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to Marcus's breathing gradually slow into sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The way he'd looked at me during dinner, the questions in his eyes, the careful way Helen had studied Ellie's face. I told myself I was being paranoid. It had been an innocent comment, nothing more. People made observations about family resemblances all the time, without anyone reading deeper meaning into them. Still, I made a mental note to be more careful about what I said in the future. The last thing I needed was to create problems where none existed. The next morning at the office felt like a welcome return to normalcy. The marketing firm where I worked as a coordinator buzzed with its usual Monday energy, phones ringing, coffee brewing, and the familiar chatter of colleagues discussing their weekends. I settled into my cubicle with a large latte and began sorting through emails, grateful for the distraction from the previous night's awkward conversation. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, casting everything in a warm, optimistic light. Good morning, sunshine, my colleague Jessica called from the neighboring cubicle. At 42, she was one of those women who seemed to know everything about everyone in the office, despite being relatively new herself. How was your family dinner last night? Oh, you know how it is, I replied with a laugh, clicking through my inbox. The in-laws, good food, the usual family dynamics, nothing too exciting. Jessica peered over the partition between our desks, her auburn hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Well, speaking of family dynamics, I saw something interesting on Saturday that I've been dying to ask you about. My fingers paused over the keyboard, but I kept my expression neutral. Oh, really? What was that? I was having lunch at that cute little cafe downtown. You know, the one with the amazing paninis. and I could have sworn I saw you there with a very handsome man. Jessica's eyes sparkled with curiosity. Tall, dark hair, great smile. Definitely not Marcus. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to laugh casually. Oh, that must have been Noah Lang. He's an old friend from high school who's in town for work. We grabbed a quick lunch to catch up. Noah Lang, Jessica repeated, as if testing the name. He looked very friendly. You two seemed pretty cozy for old friends. I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, but I maintained my composed demeanor. Jessica, you have such an imagination. We were just catching up over sandwiches. Nothing cozy about it. If you say so, she said with a knowing smile. He was quite attractive, though. Lucky you, having such good-looking old friends. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. Hey, got a weird call from Mum this morning. She said Helen called her asking questions about your dating history before Marcus. What's going on? I stared at the message, feeling my stomach drop. Helen was already making inquiries, which meant my dinner comment had bothered her more than I'd realized. I quickly typed back, "Nothing's going on. Made a silly joke at dinner, and everyone's overreacting. You know how Helen gets." Sophie's response came immediately. What kind of joke? Mum seemed really concerned. Just commented that Ellie has similar features to someone I used to date. Completely innocent observation that everyone's blowing out of proportion. Ophelia, please tell me you're not doing anything stupid. I set my phone aside without responding, irritated by everyone's sudden need to analyze my every word. It was ridiculous how one innocent comment could spiral into this level of scrutiny. Everything okay? Jessica asked, noticing my expression. Just family drama, I replied with a dismissive wave. You know how relatives can be. They hear one thing and suddenly create this whole narrative that doesn't exist. Tell me about it, Jessica agreed. My sister once convinced half the family that I was having an affair because she saw me having coffee with my divorce lawyer. People love to assume the worst. The comparison made me feel slightly better. People did jump to conclusions, and I was clearly dealing with a case of mass overreaction to an innocent comment. Around lunchtime, I received a call from Noah. His voice was warm and familiar, with that slight rasp that had always made my pulse quicken. Hey, beautiful, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. How are you feeling after our lunch on Saturday? I've been thinking about you. I glanced around the office, making sure no one was listening, and lowered my voice. I'm fine, but we need to be more careful. Someone from work saw us at the cafe. Really? What did you tell them? That we're old friends catching up, which is technically true. Noah chuckled. Technically true is the best kind of true. Did they buy it? I think so, but my family is asking questions about something else entirely. I may have made a comment about Ellie that got people's attention. There was a pause on the other end. What kind of comment? I explained the dinner situation, and Noah was quiet for a long moment. Ophelia, that was probably not the smartest thing to say. It was just a joke, I insisted, feeling defensive. People make comments like that all the time. Not when they're having an affair with the person their kid supposedly resembles, Noah pointed out. We're not having an affair, I said quickly. We're just reconnecting, exploring what we used to have. Right, Noah said, but he sounded less convinced than usual. Well, maybe we should cool things down for a while. Let the dust settle. The suggestion made me panic slightly. Noah, you're overreacting just like everyone else. There's no dust to settle. It was one innocent comment. If you say so, babe. But I think we should be extra careful for the next few weeks. After he hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen, feeling frustrated and misunderstood. Everyone was acting like I'd committed some terrible crime when all I'd done was make an observation. That evening, Marcus seemed distracted during dinner. He kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and he was unusually quiet while helping Ellie with her homework. Is everything okay? I asked as we were cleaning up the kitchen. You seem distant tonight. Just thinking about some things, he he replied, loading plates into the dishwasher with methodical precision. Work stuff, mostly. Anything I can help with? He paused, holding a glass up to the light to check for spots. Actually, I was wondering if you could help me understand our phone bill. There are some numbers I don't recognize, and I'm trying to figure out if we're being charged for services we don't need. My blood ran cold, but I kept my voice steady. Of course. Which numbers are you looking at? There's one that shows up quite a bit over the past few months. Long conversations, multiple calls per week. He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. This one here. It was Noah's number. I recognized it immediately, but I forced myself to look puzzled. That's strange. I don't recognize that number off the top of my head. Maybe it's a work contact. You know how many clients and vendors I have to call for campaigns? Marcus nodded slowly. That makes sense. I was just trying to see if we could reduce our bill somehow. Smart thinking, I said, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek. You're always looking out for our budget. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Just trying to be responsible. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught Marcus looking through some papers at his desk in the corner of our bedroom. When he noticed me watching, he quickly shuffled them together and put them in a drawer. What are you working on? I asked casually. Just some client files I brought home. Nothing interesting. But something about his tone made me suspicious. Marcus was usually an open book about his work, often boring me with detailed explanations of tax codes and accounting procedures. This sudden secretiveness was unlike him. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were slowly closing in around me. Helen's questions, Jessica's observations, Sophie's concern, and now Marcus's sudden interest in phone bills and mysterious paperwork. I told myself I was being paranoid. These were all coincidences, unrelated events that I was connecting in my mind because of guilt and anxiety. There was no conspiracy, no investigation, no reason to panic. But as I listened to Marcus's steady breathing beside me, I wondered if he was really asleep or just pretending, the way I was pretending that everything was perfectly normal. 2 weeks later, Marcus suggested we take both sets of parents out for a nice dinner at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant downtown that we usually reserved for special occasions. He said he wanted to treat everyone after the busy tax season he'd just finished. I was thrilled by the gesture. It felt like a return to normalcy, a sign that whatever tension had existed after my dinner comment was finally dissipating. I spent extra time getting ready, choosing an elegant black dress and my favorite pearl earrings. You look beautiful, Marcus said as we walked into the restaurant, his hand resting gently on the small of my back. The familiar gesture made me feel secure and loved. Romano's was exactly as I remembered. Soft lighting, white tablecloths, and the gentle murmur of conversation mixed with classical music. The hostess led us to a large round table where both sets of parents were already waiting. Ophelia, sweetheart, my mother Carolyn said, rising to give me a hug. At 55, she maintained the same nurturing warmth that had made her a beloved kindergarten teacher. You look lovely. Doesn't she look lovely, Helen? Helen smiled politely, but I noticed she didn't echo the compliment. Instead, she focused her attention on Ellie, who was wearing a pretty blue dress and had her hair in carefully braided pigtails. Ellie, you look like a little princess, Helen said, adjusting one of the braids with gentle fingers. Those eyes of yours are just stunning, so unusual and bright. I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the comment about Ellie's eyes, but I pushed it aside. Helen was just being a doting grandmother. Dennis and my stepfather Robert were already deep in conversation about baseball, and the atmosphere felt warm and familial as we settled into our seats and perused the menus. I'm thinking the osso buco, Marcus announced, scanning the entrees. What about you, honey? The salmon sounds perfect, I replied, feeling relaxed and happy to be surrounded by family. The conversation flowed easily through appetizers and salads. We discussed Ellie's upcoming school play, Dennis's retirement plans, and my mother's garden. Everything felt perfectly normal until Helen brought up a topic that made my stomach clench. "Ophelia, I've been thinking about that comment you made a few weeks ago," Helen said, cutting her chicken piccata with precise movements, "about Ellie resembling your high school boyfriend." The table went quiet, except for the gentle clink of silverware. I felt everyone's eyes turn toward me, and my cheeks began to burn. "Oh, that," I said with a forced laugh. "I told you that was just a silly observation. People say things like that all the time." "But it's been bothering me," Helen continued, her voice taking on that measured tone I'd come to dread. "Because Ellie really does have such distinctive features, those eyes, the bone structure. It made me curious about this boyfriend of yours." Marcus set down his fork and looked at me expectantly. Even my own parents seemed interested in the conversation, leaning forward slightly. "Helen, I really don't think this is appropriate dinner conversation," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It was just a random comment that didn't mean anything." "What was his name?" Helen pressed. "This high school sweetheart?" I felt trapped, like a deer in headlights. Why does it matter? That was over 15 years ago." "Just curious," Helen said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You seemed so certain about the resemblance." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Ellie was looking back and forth between the adults with confused eyes, sensing the tension, but not understanding it. "His name was Noah," I finally said, hoping that would end the discussion. "Noah Lang. But like I said, it was just a random observation." "Noah Lang," Helen repeated, as if filing the name away for future reference. "And you haven't seen him recently?" The question felt like a trap, and I realized with growing horror that Helen might already know more than she was letting on. "Actually," I said, deciding that partial honesty might be my best strategy, "he's in town on business, and we had lunch a couple weeks ago, just catching up as old friends." Marcus's head snapped up at this revelation. "You had lunch with your ex-boyfriend and didn't mention it?" "It wasn't important enough to mention," I said defensively. "We grabbed sandwiches and talked about work and old classmates. It was completely innocent." "If it was so innocent, why didn't you tell me about it?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. Everyone at the table was staring at me, and I felt like I was on trial for crimes I hadn't committed. "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," I snapped, my composure finally cracking. "Making a big deal out of nothing. It was just lunch between old friends." "Old friends who your daughter supposedly resembles," Dennis said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken during the entire exchange, and his words carried extra weight because of his usual silence. "Oh my God," I said, throwing my napkin down on the table. "Are you people seriously suggesting what I think you're suggesting? This is insane." Ellie's eyes filled with tears at my raised voice. "Mummy, why are you angry?" "I'm not angry, sweetheart," I said, immediately regretting my outburst. "The adults are just having a discussion." "A discussion about whether Daddy is really my daddy?" Ellie asked with the brutal honesty that only children possess. The question hung in the air like a bomb. My mother gasped softly, and even Robert looked uncomfortable. "Of course Daddy is your daddy," I said quickly, reaching over to smooth Ellie's hair. "No one is saying otherwise." But Marcus was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Hurt, confusion, and something that looked like determination. "Maybe we should discuss this at home," he said quietly, signaling the waiter for the check. "There's nothing to discuss," I insisted, but my voice sounded shrill even to my own ears. The ride home was silent, except for Ellie's quiet sniffling in the back seat. She'd been upset by the tension at dinner, and I felt terrible for causing her distress over what should have been a simple family meal. Once we got Ellie settled in bed with extra hugs and reassurances, Marcus and I faced each other in our bedroom with the weight of the evening between us. "I want the truth," he said simply. all of it. I've told you the truth, I replied, but even I could hear the weakness in my voice. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me something that made my blood run cold. It was a photo of me and Noah at the cafe, laughing over lunch, sitting closer together than old friends should. My mum took this when she was downtown shopping last week, Marcus said quietly. She wanted to surprise you by saying hello, but then she saw how friendly you two looked. I stared at the photo, seeing myself through Helen's eyes. Noah and I were leaning toward each other across the small table, my hand resting near his on the surface. To an outside observer, we definitely looked like more than just old friends catching up. Marcus, I can explain. No more lies, Ophelia. I'm getting a DNA test. The words hit me like a physical blow. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. The next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy and underlying tension. Marcus went to work, I went to the office, and we both pretended that everything was fine for Ellie's sake, but I could feel him watching me, studying my every move and expression. I tried to reach out to Noah several times, but he wasn't returning my calls. When I finally caught him at his hotel, he sounded distant and distracted. "This is getting too complicated, Ophelia," he said. "Maybe we should take a break until things calm down." "Things will calm down," I insisted. "This is all just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion." "A misunderstanding that involves DNA tests?" Noah's voice was skeptical. "That's pretty serious territory." "Marcus is just being paranoid. Once the test proves he's Ellie's father, everything will go back to normal." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "And what if the test doesn't prove that?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to address directly. "Of course it will," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Ophelia, we need to talk about the timeline here. When exactly was Ellie conceived?" I did the math in my head, something I'd been avoiding for years. It could have been either of you. The timing was close." "Jesus Christ," Noah muttered. "Do you realize what this means?" "It means nothing," I said firmly. "Lots of couples go through paternity scares. It doesn't mean anything is wrong." But even as I said the words, I knew how hollow they sounded. That evening, Marcus came home with a small package from the pharmacy. The DNA test kit looked innocuous enough. Just a simple box with clinical instructions and sterile swabs. "We're really doing this?" I asked, staring at the kit like it might explode. "We're really doing this," Marcus confirmed, "unless you want to tell me something that would make it unnecessary." I looked into his eyes, searching for some sign of the man who had loved me unconditionally for 8 years. But all I saw was a stranger who had been betrayed and was determined to find the truth. "There's nothing to tell," I said quietly. The actual test was surprisingly simple and anticlimactic. A few swabs inside the cheek, sealed in sterile containers, and mailed off to a laboratory. The whole process took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like we were dismantling our entire life together. Ellie was curious about the procedure, asking innocent questions about why Daddy needed to prove he was her father. Marcus handled her questions with gentle patience, explaining that sometimes adults need to be sure about important things. "But you are my daddy, right?" she asked, climbing into his lap with the complete trust that only children possess. "I'll always be your daddy, no matter what," Marcus said, hugging her tight. "Nothing will ever change that." The promise made me feel slightly better. Even if the worst happened, Marcus would still be the only father Ellie had ever known. The waiting period was torture. The lab said results would be available in 5 to 7 business days, but each day felt like a week. I found myself jumping every time the phone rang or an email arrived. Sophie called several times, trying to get more information about what was happening. I told her about the DNA test, hoping for sympathy and support. "Ophelia, please tell me you're not having an affair," she said bluntly. "I'm not having an affair," I replied, which was technically true. What Noah and I had was more complicated than a simple affair. Then why are you so worried about this test? I'm not worried. I'm just upset that my husband doesn't trust me enough to take my word for it. But Sophie knew me too well to buy that explanation. If you're innocent, then the test will prove it and everything will be fine. Unless there's something you're not telling me. I ended the call without giving her a direct answer, frustrated by everyone's need to question and analyze everything I said. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus called me at work with a tone I'd never heard before. The results are in, he said simply. We need to talk tonight after Ellie goes to bed. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. Jessica noticed my distress and asked if everything was okay, but I couldn't even form a coherent response. The evening felt surreal. We went through the motions of a normal family dinner, helped Ellie with her homework, and read her bedtime story. But underneath it all was the knowledge that everything was about to change. Once Ellie was asleep, Marcus and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the envelope between us. It looked so ordinary, just a standard manila envelope with a laboratory logo, but I knew it contained the power to destroy everything I'd built. Do you want to open it, or should I? Marcus asked. You do it, I whispered. He tore open the envelope with steady hands and pulled out several sheets of official-looking papers. I watched his face as he read, seeing his expression change from tense anticipation to something much darker. The probability of paternity is 0%, he said in a voice I barely recognized. I am not Ellie's biological father. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known this moment might come. Seeing it in black and white with scientific certainty made it real in a way that all my denials and rationalizations couldn't overcome. Marcus, I can explain. No. His voice was quiet but firm. No more explanations, no more lies, no more gaslighting me into thinking I'm crazy for asking questions. He stood up from the table and walked to the window, staring out at our backyard, where Ellie's swing set stood silhouetted in the darkness. 6 years, he said quietly. 6 years of believing she was mine. 6 years of loving her, raising her, being proud of every milestone and accomplishment. She is yours, I said desperately. Biology doesn't change the fact that you're her father in every way that matters. Marcus turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. You're right about that, he said. She is mine and I will always love her. But you, I don't even know who you are anymore. The finality in his voice terrified me more than anything else that had happened. Marcus, please, we can work through this. Couples overcome infidelity all the time. We can go to counseling. We can... This isn't just infidelity, Ophelia. This is 6 years of living a lie. 6 years of letting me believe something that wasn't true. 6 years of deception so complete that you made jokes about it at family dinners. The reference to my original comment felt like a knife twisting in my chest. That stupid joke had started this avalanche, and now everything was buried under the weight of the truth. I never meant for it to happen this way, I said weakly. How did you mean for it to happen? Marcus asked. Were you planning to tell me eventually, or were you going to let me live my entire life believing a lie? I didn't have an answer for that question, because the truth was that I'd never planned for any of this. I'd just been living day by day, hoping the secret would stay buried forever. Marcus gathered up the DNA test results and headed toward the stairs. Where are you going? I asked. To pack a bag. I'm staying at my parents' house tonight. Tomorrow I'm calling a lawyer. The words hit me like a death sentence. Marcus, please don't do this. Think about Ellie. Think about our family. He paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to me. I am thinking about Ellie. That's why I'm going to fight for custody. She deserves at least one parent who doesn't lie to her. The next morning, I woke up alone in our king-sized bed, staring at the empty space where Marcus should have been. The house felt eerily quiet without his usual morning routine of showering, making coffee, and checking the news on his tablet. Ellie noticed his absence immediately when she came downstairs for breakfast. Where's Daddy? she asked, climbing into her usual chair at the kitchen table. He had to leave early for work, I lied, pouring cereal into her bowl. He'll see you later. But Marcus didn't come home that evening, or the next. When Ellie asked about him, I gave vague explanations about work trips and busy schedules. She seemed to accept my answers, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. On Monday, a courier arrived at my office with an envelope that made my blood run cold. The return address was from Patterson and Associates, a law firm downtown that I recognized as one of the most aggressive in family court. Inside were divorce papers and a petition for full custody of Ellie. I stared at the documents in shock, unable to process what I was reading. Marcus was asking for everything: the house, primary custody, and spousal support. The petition cited adultery, deception, and emotional harm to the minor child as grounds for his requests. My hands were shaking as I called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Marcus, we need to talk," I said after the beep. "You can't just serve me with papers without discussing this first. Call me back." He didn't call back. That evening, I drove to his parents' house, hoping to reason with him face to face. Helen answered the door with a cold expression that I'd never seen before. "He doesn't want to see you, Ophelia." "Helen, please, I just need to explain." "Explain what? That you've been lying to our family for 6 years? That you let my son believe he was raising his own child when you knew there was a chance he wasn't?" The accusation stung because it was partially true. I had known there was a possibility, but I'd chosen to believe what I wanted to believe. "I never knew for sure," I said weakly. The timing was so close, and I genuinely thought Marcus was her father. "But you knew it was possible that he wasn't," Helen said, her voice like ice, "and you chose to keep that possibility to yourself." I could see Marcus through the window, sitting at their kitchen table with legal documents spread in front of him. He looked older somehow, as if the stress of the past week had aged him years. "Can I at least see Ellie?" I asked. "She's not here. Marcus took her to dinner and a movie. He's trying to maintain some normalcy for her while you two sort this mess out." The fact that my own daughter was somewhere else, being cared for by her father, while I stood on the doorstep like a stranger, hit me harder than anything else. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of to reach Marcus. I called his office, but his secretary said he was unavailable. I sent emails that went unanswered. I even showed up at his favorite lunch spot, but he wasn't there. Meanwhile, the legal machinery was moving forward with frightening efficiency. My own lawyer, a kind woman named Patricia Chen, reviewed the documents and gave me a sobering assessment. "He has a strong case," she said, sitting across from me in her downtown office. "The DNA evidence, combined with proof of your affair, gives him significant leverage in custody proceedings." "What proof of an affair?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Patricia pulled out a folder thick with documents and photographs. Phone records showing frequent contact with Noah Lang, restaurant receipts, hotel records, and several photographs of you two together in compromising situations. I stared at the evidence in horror. Marcus had been building a case against me for weeks, methodically gathering proof while I thought I was managing the situation. "How did he get all this?" "He hired a private investigator," Patricia explained. "Your husband is an accountant, Ophelia. He knows how to follow paper trails and document everything." The realization that Marcus had been investigating me while pretending everything was normal felt like another betrayal, even though I knew I had no right to feel betrayed. "What are my options?" I asked. "Limited," Patricia said honestly. "We can fight the custody petition, but given the circumstances, the best we can probably hope for is shared custody. As for the house and other assets, adultery gives him grounds to claim a larger portion." "This is insane," I said, feeling overwhelmed by the speed at which my life was unraveling. "One mistake and I lose everything." Patricia looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. "Ophelia, this wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern of deception that lasted for years. The court is going to focus on what's best for Ellie, and right now, that appears to be stability with her father. That evening, I finally managed to reach Noah on the phone. He sounded stressed and distant. "This is getting out of hand," he said before I could even explain the situation. "I've got lawyers calling me, asking questions about our relationship. My company is starting to ask questions too." "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "I never wanted you to get dragged into this." "Well, I am dragged into it, and frankly, I'm not sure I want to be. This whole thing is a mess, Ophelia." The conversation made me feel more alone than ever. The man I'd risked everything for was already distancing himself from the consequences of our choices. Sophie was the only person who still seemed willing to listen to my side of the story, but even she was struggling to understand my decisions. "Why didn't you just tell Marcus the truth from the beginning?" she asked during one of our phone conversations. "If you weren't sure about paternity, you could have gotten a test years ago." "Because I was scared," I admitted. "I was young and pregnant and scared of losing everything. So instead, you built your entire marriage on a lie." The harsh assessment from my own sister felt like a final judgment. Even the people who loved me most were having trouble defending my choices. As the legal proceedings moved forward, I found myself increasingly isolated. Friends who had once been part of our social circle were taking sides, and most of them were choosing Marcus. He was the wrong party, the devoted father who had been deceived, while I was the unfaithful wife who had destroyed her family. The irony wasn't lost on me that the joke I'd made to deflect suspicion had ultimately led to the very scrutiny I'd been trying to avoid. If I had just kept my mouth shut at that family dinner, none of this might have happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't really true. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and all my jokes and deflections had only delayed the inevitable. 3 months later, I sat in a sterile courthouse conference room, fluorescent lights exposing every flaw. Across from me, Marcus, navy suit, composed, looked like a stranger, not the man who once brought me Sunday coffee. His lawyer, Jennifer Walsh, laid out DNA proof. Marcus wasn't Ellie's father. 6 years of deception exposed. Photos, texts, hotel receipts followed. My affair with Noah, no longer deniable. Judge Morrison, stern and fair, asked me to explain. I stood, legs shaking. I was 26, pregnant after a rough patch. I believed Marcus was the father. I chose hope over doubt. "You never tested?" she pressed. "No. I feared breaking our family." The psychologist's report sealed it. Ellie thrived with Marcus, anxious without him. Primary custody, his. Mine, supervised visits every other weekend. Assets, 70% to Marcus, including the house. Adultery weighed heavy. Marcus approached post-ruling. "I don't hate you, Ophelia. Ellie will know her mother, but trust is gone." Alone in my tiny apartment, Noah texted, "Sorry, no more contact." The family dinner joke, Ellie's resemblance to Noah, haunted me. I'd gambled on a lie and lost everything. Marcus's revenge wasn't rage, it was justice, methodical and complete. My new reality, fleeting supervised hours with Ellie. Marcus would be the parent I wasn't. The joke was on me. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.